Oliver Twist is born. Oliver Twist was born in a workhouse, and for a long time after his birth there was Oliver Twist is born. Oliver Twist was born in a workhouse, and for a long time after his birth there was considerable doubt whether the child would live. He lay breathless for some time, trying to decide between this world and the next. After a few struggles, however, he breathed, coughed and gave a loud cry. The pale face of a young woman was raised weakly from the bed, and in a faint voice she said,
"Let me see the child and die."
"Oh, you must not talk about dying yet," said the doctor, as he rose from where he was sitting near the fire and advanced towards her.
"Goodness, no,"
added the poor old woman who was acting as nurse. The doctor placed the child in its mother's arms. She pressed her cold white lips on its forehead, passed her hands over her face, looked wildly around, fell back, and died. "It's all over," said the doctor at last.
Poor dear, so it is.
Exclamation mark, said the old nurse. She was a good-looking girl, too, added the doctor. "Where did she come from?"
"She was brought here last night,"
replied the old woman.
"She was found lying in the street. She had walked some distance, for her shoes were torn to pieces, but where she came from, or where she was going, nobody knows."
"The old story," said the doctor, shaking his head as he raised the dead woman's left hand. "No wedding ring, I see. Ah, good night." While the nurse dressed him, Oliver cried loudly. If he had known, though, what the future held for him, the motherless child would have cried even louder. Early years. For the next 8 or 10 months Oliver was bottle-fed when anyone remembered to attend to him. Then he was sent to a smaller workhouse some 3 miles away, where 20 or 30 other young orphans rolled about the floor all day, without the inconvenience of too much food or too much clothing. They were in the charge of an elderly woman called Mrs. Mann, who received from the government 7.5 pence each week for each child. Being a woman of wisdom and experience, she knew what was good for the children and what was good for herself. So she kept the greater part of the weekly allowance for her own use, and gave the children hardly enough to keep them alive. It cannot be expected that this system of bringing up children would produce any very strong or healthy specimens. On his 9th birthday, Oliver Twist was a pale, weak child. A chimney sweep offers to take Oliver for weeks after early years. He was spending his ninth birthday in the coal cellar with 2 other children. They had, all 3, been beaten by Mrs. Mann and then locked up for daring to say they were hungry. Suddenly, Mrs. Mann was surprised by the appearance of Mr. Bumble, a workhouse official, a fat man, full of a sense of his own importance. The purpose of his visit was to take Oliver back to the large workhouse, for he was now too old to remain with Mrs. Mann. Oliver, whose face and hands had by this time been washed in a hurry, was led into the room by his kind-hearted protectress.
"Make a bow to the gentleman, Oliver,"
said Mrs. Mann. Oliver obeyed. "Will you go along with me, Oliver?" said Mr. Bumble in his clear, ringing tones. Oliver was about to say that he would be happy to go along with anybody when, looking upward, he caught sight of Mrs. Mann, who was standing behind Mr. Bumble's chair and making threatening gestures at him. He understood what she meant at once. "Will she go with me?" asked poor Oliver. "No, she can't," replied Mr. Bumble. "But she'll come and see you sometimes." Oliver pretended to be very sad at going away. It was easy for him to call tears into his eyes. Hunger and recent bad treatment are of great assistance if you want to cry, and Oliver cried very naturally indeed. Mrs. Mann gave him 1,000 kisses and, what Oliver wanted a great deal more, Mrs. Mann gave him 1,000 Mrs. Man gave him 1,000. Mrs. Man gave him 1,000 kisses and, what Oliver wanted a great deal more, a piece of bread and butter, so that he should not seem too hungry when he got to the workhouse. Oliver was led away by Mr. Bumble from the home where not a single kind word or look had ever lighted the darkness of his early years. Life in the workhouse was very severe indeed. The members of the board of management had ruled that the children should work to earn their living, and that they should be given 3 meals of thin soup a day, with an onion twice a week and half a cake on Sundays. The room in which the boys were fed was a large stone hall, with a huge pot at one end. Out of this the master, assisted by 1 or 2 women, served out the soup at mealtimes. Each boy had one small bowl, and nothing more, except on public holidays, when he had a small piece of bread as well. The bowls never needed washing. The boys polished them with their spoons till they shone again, and when they had performed this operation they would sit staring eagerly at the huge pot, as if they could have eaten that too. Hunger in silence for 3 months. In the end they became so desperate that one boy, who was tall for his age, told the others that he had a wild hungry eye, and they fully believed him. A council was held, votes were cast, and it fell to Oliver Twist to walk up to the master after supper that evening and ask for more. The evening arrived. The boys took their places. The master, in his cook's uniform, stood beside the huge pot with his 2 assistants behind him. The soup was served out. It quickly disappeared. The boys whispered to each other and made signs to Oliver. He rose from the table and, advancing to the master, bowl in hand, said, "Please, sir, I want some more." The master was a fat, healthy man, but he turned very pale. He stared with horror and amazement at the small boy for some seconds. "What?" he said finally in a faint voice. "Please, sir," replied Oliver, "I want some more." The master aimed a blow at Oliver's head with his big spoon, seized him tightly in his arms, and shouted for Mr. Bumble. Mr. Bumble, hearing the cry and learning the cause of it, rushed into the room where members of the board were meeting and, addressing the gentleman at the head of the table, said, "Mr. Limpkins, I beg your pardon, sir. Oliver Twist has asked for more." There was general alarm. Horror showed on every face. "For more," said Mr. Limpkins. "Be calm, Bumble, and answer me clearly. Do you mean to say that he asked for more, after he had eaten the supper given by the board?" "He did, sir," replied Bumble. "That boy will be hanged," said one of the gentlemen on the board. "I know that boy will be hanged one day." Oliver was locked up at once. Next morning a notice was put up on the outside of the gate, offering a reward of £5 to anybody who would take Oliver Twist away from the workhouse. A chimney sweep offers to take Oliver, for weeks after committing the crime of asking for more. Oliver remained a prisoner in the dark and lonely room to which he had been sent by the board as a punishment. But let it not be supposed by the enemies of the system that Oliver, while a prisoner, was denied the benefit of exercise or the pleasure of society. As for exercise, it was nice cold weather, and he was allowed to wash himself every morning under the pump in a stone yard in the presence of Mr. Bumble, who prevented his catching cold by the repeated use of a stick. As for society, he was carried every other day into the hall where the boys dined, and there he was publicly beaten as a warning and example. It happened one morning that Mr. Ganfield, a chimney sweep, was on his way down the high street, wondering how to pay the rent he owed to his landlord. Passing the workhouse, his eyes fell on the notice on the gate. He walked closer to read it. One of the gentlemen on the board was standing at the gate. The chimney sweep, observing him, told him that he wanted. One of the gentlemen on the board was standing at the gate. The chimney sweep, observing him, told him that he wanted an apprentice and was ready to take the boy offered. The gentleman ordered him to walk in and took him to Mr. Limpkins. Arrangements were made. Mr. Bumble was at once instructed that Oliver Twist and the papers for his apprenticeship were to be taken before the magistrate for approval that very afternoon. On his way to the magistrate, Mr. Bumble instructed Oliver that all he would have to do would be to look very happy and say, when the gentleman asked him if he wanted to be apprenticed, that he would like it very much indeed. Eventually they arrived at the office and appeared before the magistrate, an old gentleman with a pair of eyeglasses. "This is the boy, sir," said Mr. Bumble. "Bow to the magistrate, my dear." Oliver made his best bow. "Well," said the old gentleman, "I suppose he's fond of sweeping chimneys?" "He's very fond of it, sir," replied Bumble, giving Oliver a threatening look. "And this man that's to be his master, you, sir, you'll treat him well, and feed him, and do all that sort of thing, will you?" said the old gentleman. "When I say I will, I mean I will," replied Mr. Gamfield roughly. "You're well," said "You're a rough speaker, my friend, but you look an honest, open-hearted man," said the old gentleman, turning his eyeglasses in the direction of Gamfield, on whose face cruelty was clearly stamped. But the magistrate was half blind, so he could not reasonably be expected to see what other people saw. The magistrate fixed his eyeglasses more firmly on his nose, and began to look about him for the inkpot. It was a critical moment in Oliver's future. If the inkpot had been where the old gentleman thought it was, he would have been led away at once. But as it happened to be immediately under his nose, he looked all over his desk for it without finding it, and chancing in the course of his search to look straight ahead of him, his eyes met the pale and frightened face of Oliver Twist, who was staring at the cruel face of his future master with a mixture of horror and fear. The old gentleman stopped, laid down his pen, and looked from Oliver to Mr. Bumble. "My boy," said the old gentleman, leaning over the desk, "you look pale and alarmed. What is the matter? Stand a little way from him, Mr. Bumble. Now, boy, tell us what's the matter. Don't be afraid." Oliver fell on his knees and, joining his hands together, begged the magistrate to order him back to the dark room, beat him, kill him if he liked, rather than send him away with that awful man. "Well," said Mr. Bumble, raising his hands and eyes, "well, of all the ungrateful orphans that I have ever seen, you are one of the most shameless." "Hold your tongue," said the magistrate. "I refuse to sign these papers." He pushed the documents aside as he spoke. "Take the boy back to the workhouse, and treat him kindly. He seems to need it." Next morning the public were again informed that £5 would be paid to anybody who would take possession of Oliver Twist. Oliver is apprenticed to an undertaker. Mr. Bumble was returning one day to the workhouse when he met at the gate Mr. Sowerberry, the undertaker, a tall, bony man dressed in a worn-out black suit. As Mr. Sowerberry advanced to Mr. Bumble, he shook him by the hand and said, "I have taken the measurements of the 2 women that died last night, Mr. Bumble." "You'll make your fortune, Mr. Sowerberry," said Mr. Bumble. "Think so?" said the undertaker. "The prices allowed by the board are very small, Mr. Bumble." "So are the coffins," replied the latter. Mr. Sowerberry laughed for a long time at this joke. Well, Mr. Bumble," he said finally, "I don't deny that, since the new system of feeding has been introduced. The coffins are somewhat narrower than they used to be, but we must have some profit, Mr. Bumble. Wood is expensive, sir,